Hi, I'm delighted to be here, and I want to thank the philosopher and Anthony Morgan and Urja Lakhani for organizing the event. Kea Mitra and Kea is in the audience today, and we've just been delighted at the reception to feminist philosophy of mind. There have been 3 recent APA panels on the book. There was a reading group organized by Jody Russell and Adriana Sanchez, and there's just been a lot of interest since the book has been published about less than a year ago. So today we are specifically going to focus on the mind-body relationship, and we hope to talk about feminist philosophy of mind. We have 3 wonderful authors from the book, not only in the context of the book, but also beyond, and thinking about the general field of feminist philosophy of mind and other work that's been inspired by the book and that's been happening as well. I want to just give a short introduction. I have 3 slides that I'm going to share with you right now before we get into the questions for the panelists. Okay. Everyone can see the screen? So Kea and I started this project to edit this book in 2012, so it's been over 10 years in the process. What we did is there's been work going on in feminist philosophy of mind for decades and throughout history. But what Kea and I wanted to do was really formalize the field and consolidate a number of articles so we could introduce the field in an official way. So we have defined feminist philosophy of mind as an area of study that investigates the nature of mind with reference to social locations and social categories, such as gender, race, class, sexuality, nationality, and ability. And the second part, this is really important as well, investigates the nature of social location with reference to theories about the mind. As I said, there's been a lot of work in this area prior to the publication of this anthology. Here are some of the key texts that are taking up issues. A lot of feminists are working on issues of the self, of emotion, of trauma, consciousness, embodiment, This Bridge Called My Back, a number of other important anthologies that led up to this moment of officially naming the field. And I wanted to give you this last slide because here what we did is we made a list of the when the philosophical subfields were anthologized, starting with Claudia Cart's Feminist Ethics in 1991, moving up through feminist epistemology, through bioethics, aesthetics, science, environmental philosophy, religion, metaphysics, history of philosophy. And then it's only in 2022 that we get the subfield officially of feminist philosophy of mind. So that's something to think about. You know, why did it take this long to have an official anthology in this way? So the last thing I'll say before I start asking the questions is that, and I'll stop sharing my screen here. In this book, there's 21 chapters, and the section on the body-mind relationship, we call it the body-mind relationship, comes at the end of the text rather than at the beginning, like in classical philosophy of mind anthologies, because the notions of the body that feminist philosophers work with and philosophers of mind work with are complicated, and as well as notions of the mind. So feminists generally reject naturalistic or essentialistic approaches to the body, and also feminists often reject individualist or non-relational conceptions of mind. So with that, we'll get started. I have 3 questions, and we'll start the first one with Janine. Janine, Has feminist philosophy of mind taken up the classic question of the mind-body relationship? If so, how does theorizing about this relationship show up in feminist philosophy of mind? What are the political stakes of theorizing the mind separate from or together with the body? Oh, you need to unmute, Janine.
Thank you, Jen. No, first of all, I would like to thank the organizers of this event. I tend to enjoy the programs that the philosopher puts on. I enjoy them, so I enjoy participating in it. But also, I really want to thank Jennifer McWeeny and Kea Maitra for inviting me to be part of this fantastic volume. And I feel that the way that they invited, the way that they didn't just invite people to write something or to contribute something. I feel that their way of having you participate in the construction of the volume was an enactment of great feminist praxis. And so I would like to recognize that. It's not done all the time. We often talk about mind and body, but we also talk about theory and praxis. We could, if you wanted to put theory where mind is, praxis where body is, body doing something, but they brought those two things together. And I often find in various fields, in various realms of the world, you can have feminist theory and not have feminist praxis. So when the two join, it's something else. So anyway, to answer your question, Jen, I'm going to try to answer it short because you see I go on too long, which is why I tried to write something down a little bit. But yes, I do feel that I do think that feminist philosophers in various realms have taken on the mind-body problem as it's been traditionally understood, and they've done this in different ways. One of the ways that we know, Jen is also the chief editor of the Simone de Beauvoir Studies Journal, and recently there was a translation. It was Nancy Bauer's work that was translated, and Nancy Bauer actually took that on in a book that she wrote. And she's looking at Simone de Beauvoir, some of Simone de Beauvoir's work with respect to the, Descartes' second meditation. And as some of you may or may not know, in that second meditation, Descartes thinks that he can doubt, he's asking whether he can doubt whether he exists. And so he goes through this kind of thought experiment, and he subtracts away his body in this imaginative thought experiment. What Nancy Bauer points out is that Simone de Beauvoir did not think that she could do that. She didn't think that she could start with subtracting away her body. In fact, she had to start as her foundation as I am a woman. And woman, whatever a woman is in Western conceptions, it would be essentially a bodied thing. So let me go quickly now, because let me go quickly. So I will just say, but Beauvoir, unlike Descartes, could not imagine that possessing a body was contingent to who she was. But then we must ask, why does the cogito seem to go through for Descartes? And what does this suggest about the assumptions about gender and body? The political stakes, well, here is one quickly. Here's one type of political stake to consider. Undermining the hegemonic position of certain socio-political locations. The hegemonic position of white human risks losing its prestige as its body is uncovered, as its mind is shown to be, perhaps via Cavendish, as much body as it is mind, and no more mind than any other mind, and that its gender technology is not part of a natural ontology, and that the particulars comprising its mental states could go up into conceptual flames of a different framework. Thank you.
Thank you, Janine. We'll go to Amy Kind. Same question. how has feminist philosophy of mind taken up the mind-body relationship?
Thanks so much for the question. And also, I mean, I also want to start off with some thanks. I want to thank, obviously, the philosopher for hosting this event, but I really want to thank Jen and Care for the book, which I really think is a tremendous contribution, both to feminist philosophy and to philosophy of mind. And I'm very grateful for their invitation to take part, and also for their magnificent introduction to the volume, which I think really helps to put feminist philosophy of mind on the map as a discipline. And I really like that slide with the timeline. I hadn't thought about that before, but it is kind of surprising that it took till 2022 for the discipline to be sort of christened as feminist philosophy of mind, because as the previous slide showed, there was and has been a lot of work in this area for several decades, but perhaps it takes this changing of the conceptual framework to say, like, hey, what we're doing when we ask these questions is we're doing feminist philosophy of mind. And so I hope that the book will help people to sort of adopt that conceptual frame as they're asking certain kinds of questions, now that feminist philosophy of mind is really on the map as a discipline. So I guess to sort of try to direct some thought to the actual question, I think historically, probably the most clearly delineated strand of thought with relation to the mind-body problem from a feminist perspective, I think involves questioning whether adopting a position like dualism or physicalism in philosophy of mind has feminist consequences or anti-feminist consequences, and how we can work out what those consequences are. So, for example, one question would be whether, say, adopting dualism reinforces certain kinds of problematic stereotypes about gender roles, right? Or whether adopting a physicalist approach reinforces a certain kind of essentialism. So I think there are nuances there about, which position a feminist should adopt, and there are, of course, a range of other positions on the terrain in philosophy of mind. But that's one way, I think, in which feminist philosophy of mind takes up the classic question of the mind-body relationship, right? Like, what kinds of consequences do these positions have for things that feminist philosophers care about? And so that's one element, but I think there are some other elements as well. And I think there are some lessons that philosophy of mind learns from feminism about various exclusionary tendencies in the field of philosophy of mind. So and this comes out very nicely in Jen and Kaya's introduction, but the question of whose minds should we be considering and whose bodies should we be considering and what should we take as a paradigm? I think philosophy of mind learns from feminists, and thus feminist philosophy of mind addresses these kinds of questions and counters some of the exclusionary tendencies that we often see in philosophy and that we also see in philosophy of mind. That said, there are other strands in play as well that I think can shed important light on the question of the mind-body relationship. So I'll just pick a couple of examples of places that I've seen feminist philosophy of mind work in this area. So one example comes from some work relating to, say, trauma. And so I have in mind here Susan Bryson's work about questioning the dichotomy of mind and body from thinking about memory, and in particular traumatic memory. So this idea that we can think of memory as a mental state, right, seems mistaken once we think about the fact that memory often resides in the body, and the body is remembering certain events. And so I think by reflecting on trauma and traumatic memories, as Susan Bryson has done, we see reason to question the traditional dichotomy between mind and body and the traditional classification of certain states as mental states and as bodily states. And then just in my last remaining seconds, I was going to pick up on one other strand. And this actually, I think, relates to what Janine was just talking about. But there is an interesting recent piece by Sophie Grace Chappelle that raises a question about whether consciousness is gendered. And so, for example, if you imagine yourself disembodied, do you, assuming that we can, so going back to what Janine was just saying, but if you can imagine yourself disembodied, do you know your gender, right, in that imaginary thought experiment? And so that tells us certain things about gender in relation to the mind and in relation to the body. And so that's another strand that I see in feminist philosophy of mind relating to this question of the mind-body relationship. So thanks for the question.
Thank you, Amy. And the way you were talking, just one comment or question for the audience: could we think of Princess Elizabeth of Bohemia, Sojourner Truth, Simone de Beauvoir as feminist philosophers of mind in these ways? Naomi, same question. What are the political stakes of theorizing the mind-body relationship?
I want to echo the thanks from a slightly different perspective, that is for resurrecting a very, very old paper of mine and bringing it into this exciting conversation. And I'm really very, very grateful for that and thrilled to be in this exciting company. I'm going to answer the first question as it's written. Has feminist philosophy of mind taken up the classic question of the mind-body relationship? And I'm going to answer it no. And I don't think I'm disagreeing with the things that Janine and Amy have said in saying no. But I think, I mean, partly I'm a Wittgensteinian in many ways, although I read Wittgenstein through Maria Lugones, but the idea that the crucial move in the conjuring trick has been made before we think we've done anything. So we raise the question, what's the relationship between the mind and the body, as though that's completely open, but it isn't. It elides things like the relationship of whose mind to whose body. And it also reifies the mind as a thing. And that's a tendency that philosophers have quite generally, is they really, really love substantives. They want these noun things that they can then investigate. And I don't think that's a helpful way of thinking about mindedness. So if we think about embodied or bodily mindedness, that among the things that bodies like ours do is think and plan and feel and have emotions and intentions and desires and thoughts and all of that stuff. That's part of what we as embodied beings do. And separating off something called the mind is, I think, in Wittgenstein's terms, the initial move in the conjuring trick. So I answered that first question, no. But I think there's enormously exciting work going on in this area. An additional problem is that feminist philosophers and other critical theorists tend to mess with stuff. And among the things we mess with are the divisions into fields of philosophy. And the idea, I mean, I've never been able to say what my area of specialization is. I mean, I really haven't a clue. I work on a whole bunch of different stuff. And it's all feminist or in some way liberatory or whatever, and some of it has to do with mindedness. And I mean, I'll say more in response to the second question about the specific contribution of the paper that's in this volume. But in general, as feminists, we tend to smush the boundaries between different fields, and we tend not to respect those boundaries. And that, I think, is one of the great strengths of feminist and also critical race theory and disability philosophy and trans philosophy and so on. That is that we don't respect the way the mainstream of the field has divided the field up. And it goes along with this idea that there is this thing called the mind, and philosophy of mind is theorizing this thing called the mind, as opposed to theorizing a whole bunch of things that as minded beings we do. And so I want in some ways to reject the underlying assumption in that question, but go on to say that the work that's being done under this rubric, as messy as I think the rubric needs to be, is enormously exciting and transformative. Okay.
And I think that's a perfect transition to the next question, and we'll come right back to you, Naomi. So we'll start this next question with Amy. Now we want to get into some specific contributions that the panelists have made. What is your most significant contribution to feminist philosophy of mind so far? What idea or theory of yours do you think is the most important to the field at this time, and why? Amy.
Thanks, Jen, for the question. So I should say, I think that I'm a feminist and I'm a philosopher of mind, and it's only very recently in connection with this book that I've started thinking in terms of feminist philosophy of mind, as we talked about in terms of the field being christened. And so I would not consider myself to be one of the main movers of the field. I would defer to my other panelists, but I will talk a little bit about my paper in the book and then one other project that I've been working on. But I think it's important to note that I sort of come to feminist philosophy of mind. There are different ways of coming to feminist philosophy of mind. And I'm coming, assuming we can accept various disciplinary boundaries, which have been called into question, but I'm coming to feminist philosophy of mind from the perspective of philosophy of mind. And so when Jen and Kale were putting together this book and invited me to take part, I decided to try to tackle something that had always puzzled me, which is the starting point of Alan Turing's paper, famous paper on where he introduces what's known as the Turing test. And he introduces this test, which is designed to show how we can determine whether a machine is thinking. And the test is meant to bypass defining thinking and instead give us a kind of practical or operational way to determine it. And so he bases his test on an imitation game. The imitation game is meant to be a game about where a man and a woman are put in different rooms, and there's an interrogator trying to figure out which, or questioner, interrogator sounds so hostile, but anyway, there's a interviewer or questioner trying to figure out which is the man and which is the woman. And so Turing's test is based on this kind of gender-based imitation game. And it had always struck me that certain ways that we then take up the question of the Turing test derives from its sort of genesis in that gender-based test. And we haven't paid enough attention to how the Turing test and the discussion, the whole framing of the question of whether machines can think, the ways that it's been affected by the genesis of the test. So if you base the question, is the system a human or a machine, on the question, is the system a man or a woman, construing these questions as analogous, I think, has some interesting ramifications for how we think about thinking. It brings out various presuppositions inherent in the question of what it means to say that a machine is thinking. So my paper in the volume is intended to sort of sort all of, well, not all of that, but some of that out and see the ways in which analogizing thought to gender might lead us to various confusions about determining whether a machine can think. So that's one project of mine. And then another place where I have started to make some contributions, I think, to feminist philosophy of mind is some work that I'm doing on imagination. And so just to situate it, I think we can think about one central question in feminist philosophy of, in philosophy of mind, and likewise feminist philosophy of mind, the other minds problem. So how we can know the existence of minds other than our own, and then relatedly, how we can know about the contents of minds other than our own, right? How can we achieve understanding of other minds? And this is particularly pressing, you might think, this question of understanding when we're talking about large experiential divides. So for example, divides across gender, divides across race, divides across class, divides across nationality. I mean, they'll ability status, there'll be a very long list there. So how we can achieve understanding. And it seems as if imagination should have some important role to play, right? Like when we are trying to understand one another, we try to imagine each other's minds. But reliance on imagination in this context might seem problematic. And I think some feminists have worried about its being problematic. So it seems to involve a kind of immodesty or a lack of humility, maybe even hubris, to assume that we can imagine the experiences of others and that we can come to understand them in virtue of that. So to say to someone, you know, oh, I know what you're feeling, I just imagined it, right? That just seems sort of immodest, maybe even offensive. And I respect and agree with that sort of line of worry. But I guess in my recent work, I've been trying to push back a little bit on the exclusion of imagination from the scene here. And I think that the importance of trying to understand one another across experiential divides is and actually should be of key importance to feminists, right? We can't give up. We can't give up on the possibility of trying to understand one another. So the question is then, how do we do it? And of course, what's going to be most important is that we listen to one another, right? That we not just listen, but that we hear one another in trying to achieve understanding. But then I guess what I'm trying to push is that we can use what we hear when we genuinely listen in our imaginative efforts. And so there is still some role for imagination here. And so I've been trying to sort that out. So those are two different ways in which I've contributed.
Thank you, Amy. We'll go now to Naomi. What is your most significant contribution to the field?
Well, I like to think that I completely blew physicalism out of the water, that I made any kind of physicalism, including anomalous monism, token identity theory, functionalism, just impossible. People who work in the philosophy of mind may have noticed that I didn't succeed. And part of the reason for that is back when this was what I was working on in my dissertation, so we're going back now to the 70s, and I was developing a view of mental phenomena as socially constructed, that is, as hanging together as particulars because of what they mean and how they fit in the stories that we tell about ourselves and each other. And that if you abstract from that, they disaggregate. And the analogy that I gave was the difference between galaxies and constellations. Galaxies do not depend for their coherence and integrity on what we make of them and why we care about them. Constellations, however, do. If you abstract from certain cultures in the Northern Hemisphere of a particular planet and the particular cultures taken up by Greek mythology and blah, 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 if you abstract from that, the constellations disaggregate. The stars in them are not closer to each other than they are to other stars. It's just perspectival and a matter of meaning and interpretation. And so the question is, are mental phenomena galaxy-like or constellation-like? And I argue that they're constellation-like. Now, at the time, I was supposed to be doing this analytic philosophy of mind. But after I convinced myself that the assumptions that virtually everybody in the field were making were completely unjustified and could not possibly be true. And this was a moribund research project. I thought it was just boring and I wanted to get out. And I was connecting with people in women's studies, as it was at that time, and including colleagues that I had at the University of Minnesota, where I went in '79. And I wanted a get out of jail pass. I wanted to say, I don't want to do this stuff anymore. It's hopeless. It's a moribund research project and it's boring, boring, boring. Let me out. And my senior colleague said, we're not going to let you out unless you argue that point. So I wrote this paper, an ancestor to the paper here, and it's called Types, Tokens, and Conjuring Tricks. And it circulated in sort of samizdat form, and it went to my, what do you call it? Tenure reviewers. And it worked. They said, okay, this is good. You don't have to do this anymore. And I go, whoosh. And then, of course, what I should have done, and the problem was I entangled this paper with all this feminist stuff, Maria Lugones in particular. And that would make it unpublishable in a mainstream journal. So what I should have done, and had I had some sense I would have done, is take out all the feminism, leave in the analytic arguments that decimate physicalism, and try to get it published in the Phil Review, J-Phil, Synthèse, Mind, one of those places. I didn't do it for a number of reasons. First of all, I thought it was boring. And the other thing was I was being asked to do things. I have a very, very unusual career. Every single thing I have published was requested. And I don't know anybody else who's had a reasonably successful career of whom that's true. And so I was constantly working on things that were sort of thrown my way by people who were interested in things they thought I might be interested in. And that was so much fun that I never went back to this paper, and I never succeeded in blowing physicalism out of the water. And it sort of dropped without, a trace. And
Naomi, thank you. I'm going to stop you there just so we have enough time. We'll go to Janine for what idea or theory of yours is the most important to feminist philosophy of mind?
Well, Jen, I'm going to be a little bit of a rebel here because I don't know that I have a most, or I'm able to think in that way, but I can say that Amy's response really helped me frame how I want to talk about my work at this in this context. And it's in particular where Amy, where you were talking about you want to push back a little bit with the imagination, and we should be able to understand each other and perhaps, but I think that what my work does or tries to do is underscore the difficulty of doing that. Now, let me step back a little bit. It seems to me that in philosophy of race and gender, in Black feminist theory, critical race theory, social critical theories of other kinds, there is the recognition, or there are the arguments made, there are the claims that, and I'll stick with Black people for the moment, or for the whole discussion perhaps, Black people are misrecognized, Black people are knowable, but they're known through stereotypes. Black people, I'm working on a paper right now about Charles Mills's Black shit. They have been conceptualized as shit. They've been conceptualized as waste. When you lined up the different books that you pulled from, I will say that a master text that I need to study more and more, I could spend the rest of my life maybe studying it, and it's never boring, is Saidiya Hartman's Scenes of Subjection. Out of that kind of framework, not necessarily making a claim for Hartman, but out of a certain kind of framework, and she doesn't cast herself as an Afro-pessimist, but out of an Afro-pessimist framework, and other frameworks. Charles Mills wrote a paper on anti-Blackness, and he is no Afro-pessimist, and the Blackness is placed outside the human. So these are very strong structures, historically practiced, and they're ongoing in our empirical worlds. So there seems to be little problem in some realms with saying, yes, Black people are misrecognized. Black people are not known. Black people are knowable only through controlling images. All of these things are stated, argued for, claimed, and then all of a sudden we get to the view that I can empathize with a Black person. Now I find that stunning. Empathy is a form of imagination. I find it stunning that, you know, speaking sometimes with Kaya Mitra, we talk about different arguments, and Kaya will say to me, well, of course, I bring myself into the argument. I don't just, I'm not able to just do this thing, apparently, that Descartes could do with his body and imagine my whole historical past and present self out of the imagining. And I would like to say that what I'm suggesting is when whiteness, white people, including white women, bring themselves, which they must do, into an imagining, they are within social structures that actually preclude, for the most part, their being able to empathize with Black people in their structural situation. I'm thinking about what Amy said when Amy said, well, first we listen and then we see what we hear. And right now, I'm not remembering the name of the artist who was so hell-bent on painting Emmett Till in his open cast, and all of the Black people who talked and who said, no, do not do this. And what did she reply? Oh no, this was an empathetic act. So another thing that my work does, by looking at models of empathy and looking at the success conditions for them, is to say, well, from the perspective of these conditions, you did not succeed. It's not just you who decides from your egocentric position that, yes, I succeeded in imagining and empathizing with a Black person, even when they tell me that I did not. So I don't know if that's the most, but I think this is, and I just want to add one more thing. I'll try to do it really quickly. I want to say this. The kind of work that I've been trying to do, or the kind of work that Black feminists can do, when you do this kind of work, sometimes people ask questions like, well, why don't Black students or other people of color or whatever, why isn't there a certain kind of uptake with a certain kind of philosophy? So, like, suppose we can consider that statement. I'm going to see if I can see it here.
Janine, I'm sorry, we're gonna
I have to stop. Okay, I'll stop.
I'm sorry, but we want to make sure we have
that's
time.
okay. I could have gone on and on and on. No, do stop.
So we have one more question, and I'd like to ask the panelists to really abbreviate your responses, keep them to 2 minutes or less, just give a few examples so that we can have at least 20 minutes for discussion. This session goes until 3:15 Eastern time. And if you have questions, please use the Q&A to start writing them so that we can start taking up your questions. So the final question for the panelists, and we'll start with Naomi on this one. What is the most exciting work or exciting directions happening in feminist philosophy of mind right now? What ideas excite you? Naomi?
There's so much going on and it's so disparate, it's sort of hard to pick out anything. But one thing that I find enormously exciting is picking up on, again, Maria Lugonis's work and the idea that we make each other up, that setting the terms of intelligibility, and that sometimes we do that in extremely oppressive ways. That is, we think we know what somebody is really like, and then we treat them based on that idea of what they're really like. And other times we need to pay attention to how others make us up, and to doing what Lugones calls world travel, and the ethical, moral, political complexities of that are extremely important. One thing I've gotten into for complicated reasons over the past, 20 years, is trans philosophy. And one of the reasons I find that such a useful and interesting place to hang out and learn from trans philosophers, friends, and others is what it means to make sense, and how making sense is a material, practical activity. And we make sense of ourselves, and we make sense of each other, and we make new sense, and we resist old sense. And so it's that notion of making. So if we think of the realm of mental phenomena as a realm of interpretation, then the question of who's doing the interpreting, how is it being done, what should we learn from the reflections of ourselves in the eyes of others, when do we need to resist the reflection of ourselves in the eyes of others, and how do all of those things work? So what are the politics of sense making? And I think there's enormously important work going on there, and it touches on the imagination, and it of course touches on issues in Black feminism as well as trans feminism, that is going into a space and encountering an image of oneself that somehow is who you're being constructed to be in that space, and it can be horrific. And what do you do with that, and how do you resist? So I think there's enormously interesting work in that area.
Wonderful. Thank you, Naomi. We'll go to Janine next. What's some of the most exciting work or ideas happening in feminist philosophy of mind?
Okay, Jen, and in the service of time, I'm actually going to read this because I don't want to, okay. So Jen is, and everybody, I am reading this. Jen, I'm excited about the attribution problem, which I understand as having been engaged with for quite some time by Black feminists, some white feminists, critical race theory, and other critical social theorists. For me, what you have done, your innovation, is to have introduced, articulated, and developed the attribution pattern problem, which helps us to think about the attribution problem. Another thing you have done is reintroduce the work of Cavendish to help you articulate and develop the attribution pattern problem. And actually, I was going to say to you, and maybe you'll be able to do this, could you say a little bit about who Cavendish, this woman philosopher of mind whose panpsychism anticipates Russell's distinction between the structure and the nature of matter by several centuries? Could you perhaps say a little bit about why you think Cavendish has been neglected in traditional Western philosophy of mind, especially given the difference in panpsychism and between her and, say, Russell or Strawson? And here was a question that came up for me that I think might be an interesting one. You wrote that Strawson emphatically refuses the suggestion that tables, forks, and similarly inert objects are conscious, even though he maintains that the nature of matter is entirely experiential. I would suppose, perhaps wrongly, that Cavendish is not equating having mind or mentality with being conscious. But in any case, here's what I'm intrigued about. Wouldn't this be a type of hard problem of mind? I mean, how could something be completely experiential or mental all the way down, but then going all the way up to the macro, it fails to be mental or have mentality? What accounts for the loss? Why should there be a loss? And then the last thing I'll just say that excites me, thinking about what Naomi was saying about the conjuring trick. Isn't Cavendish a philosopher who really, if you look at her, she doesn't do the conjuring trick? She's really not, I mean, I could be wrong. I don't know her well enough to say that, but I'm not sure that she reifies mind in that way. I'm not sure that that's what she's into.
Right.
Anyway.
Thank you. Thank you, Janine. I'll make one brief comment before we move to Amy for the finale of our conversation. Yes, I mean, I think part of the reason Cavendish isn't cited today, even though she, and Leibniz is cited in discussions of panpsychism, Russell is cited, Spinoza is, Cavendish has the same kind of architecture in her theory, but isn't cited. Similar reasons why Sartre and Merleau-Ponty didn't cite Beauvoir. The power dynamics of the field and structures of approbation do not encourage citing women. You're likely to be more legitimate if you cite a different range of people. So that's just one answer. Let's move to Amy on the last question. What's most exciting to you about what's going on in feminist philosophy of mind right now?
Thanks. Well, I think it's probably a testament to the book that there are various sub-parts of philosophy of mind that are now constraining themselves specifically under a feminist lens. So, for example, there was a panel put together by Olivia Bailey last year at the Pacific APA on feminist philosophy of imagination. And I think there was some really exciting work coming out of that, work that excited me. So there was work, for example, on imaginative resistance and imaginative fragility, which connects up with some of the themes that we've been talking about today. There was an interesting paper by Sam Liao on whether there's a right not to be imagined. And you might think about this in connection with, say, sexual fantasy, and whether there are rights not to be imagined in certain ways. I gave a paper at that panel that was called Imagination, Society, and the Self, which is something I'm working on now and continue to be excited about. And the theme there is work on how a patriarchal society has stultifying effects on imagination, on what we can imagine, on the possibilities that we can imagine for ourselves. So I've done some general work in imagination about the epistemic relevance of imagination, how we can learn from imagination. And there I've talked about various constraints on imagining, and there I often talk about constraints in a positive light. It's when we constrain our imaginings that they have the most epistemic relevance. But I think when we talk about imagining future possibilities for ourselves, the constraints that are enacted in the kind of society in which we live, like a patriarchal society, the way that that society constrains not just our actions, but our imaginations, I think there paints constraints in a negative light with respect to what we can learn from imagination. So I'm interested in these sorts of stultifying effects on imagination, and it's sort of a new avenue for my work on imagination in a feminist direction. So those are some things that I'm excited about. And I really do think that the volume, it was held up before, but I really do think that the volume is going to open up lots of new possibilities for subfields in philosophy of mind, or just more generally in philosophy of mind, for people to conceive of what they're doing under this sort of and more explicitly like connect it with feminist themes.
Excellent. So I hope the audience has a taste from our conversation of how vital and exciting and complicated this field of feminist philosophy of mind is, and how much work is opening and yet to be done. Let's move now to the question and answer. So I'm going to pass it over to Urja, and I know also that the Kea Mitra is in the audience, and if Kea wants to go first, that's fine. So we welcome your questions.
Thanks everyone for the great discussion. We've got a few questions come in. I'll kick it off with a question from Mary. So Mary asks, how would you relate this discussion of feminist philosophy of mind to the study of consciousness, both from a philosophical point of view, but also from a biological perspective? So she's thinking things like neuroendocrine, etc. So I'd open it up to all the panelists, whoever wants to go.
Naomi?
I can say something really quickly. I mean, I don't work on the problem of consciousness. I just find it intractable. But I do think that it's important to go all the way down to the notion of making a difference, of things being salient. And that's a feature of thingness. So I'm kind of obsessed by stones. And that what makes a thing is responding distinctively to what's going on around it, being shaped by what it happens to it, by what's going on around it. And that it's not consciousness, but it's something. And I think the notion that the universe without us is indifferent makes no sense. Nothing can be indifferent or it wouldn't be a thing.
I just want to add one thing that in Anne Gary and Marilyn Purcell's classic anthology, they have 2 pages on feminist philosophy of mind, on philosophy of mind, and they talk about consciousness raising as the method of feminist movement. And so consciousness is something that's been theorized deeply in feminist philosophy and in philosophy of mind. And so bringing them together is very important, and thinking of an embodied consciousness, which addresses a lot of the questions we've been talking about today in terms of materialism and physicalism and new materialisms in feminism and different metaphysical and ontological configurations.
Yeah, great answers. So we have Brooke asking a question to Janine in particular, and it's about empathy. So given the limits of empathy, do you think it's ever possible to truly empathize across races? Or I guess we could extend it to genders as well. I think you're on mute, Janine.
One might want to think about this partly as having to worry about the part of that, the response or the question that would rely on something empirical. But I don't think it's just grounded in what one would say empirically about finding out what's going on in brains, et cetera. I wouldn't want to state that. I mean, one could come up, say, for example, with one could think of a situation, thought experiment, that's actually grounded in things that have happened to people. So there's a story, I don't remember her name at the moment, but it was a white woman, Killers of the Dream, the author of Killers of the Dream, whoever that was, look up her name, that's a great book. But when she was a child, her mother, her white mother, decided, looking at a group of kids playing, or a family, looking at a family, a Black family, in what she took to be a white child. She took the child, and the Black people tried to tell her, no, this is a white. They tried to tell her, but she knew better. She took the child, brought it into her family, and then found out a few weeks later, no, this is really a Black child. And so took her back. I mean, this was one of the things, Lillian Smith, that's her name, got very concerned about this, because her family wouldn't answer any questions about this. They wouldn't answer questions, but they claimed to be Christian, and she took that seriously. They claimed to be good, and she took that seriously. And they just took that little girl back and told her she was asking too many questions. Now you can imagine a thought experiment where someone is growing up in a family and they, a little bit different from that story, perhaps they think that they are Black. I've had friends, I've had people that I know in my life that look phenotypically like white people, okay, like white Americans in particular. They could later find out that they are actually Black, or you could have a person find out that they are actually white. What I mean by that is that race is socially constructed, and in this country we still go by hypodescent. So you could definitely imagine a situation where someone who was in a situation where they had grown up and thought themselves to be Black actually is white, but because they grew up as Black and thought themselves to be Black and were situated as Black and treated as Black, yes, they might be able to empathize with Black people. Now, once they become white, who knows? I don't know. I don't know what happens. Just like some people have noted, you hear stories of certain trans men who find out that their experience as men in the world is quite different from when they were treated as women. I don't say that they were women, they were treated as women. So that would be an example right there, where that could happen, where that's a possibility.
Yeah, that's a great answer. And does anyone else want to add anything, or should I move on to the next question? Okay, so we have a question from Tharun, who asks, in what ways do you think mental illness or madness poses a challenge to philosophy of mind, how it's been theorized traditionally, but also in feminist ways of thinking about it?
I think it poses a very serious challenge, and there's increasing work being done in this area by philosophers, some of whom identify as mad. I was confronted a long time ago by a paper by a student who's working with me named Thane Plantakow, who was pushing back against a narrative theory of personal identity and the difficulties in constructing a coherent narrative for somebody dealing with various kinds of mental illness. So we do have this, I mean, among the normativities of the generic mind is the normativity of what gets defined as sane and so on, and that can be seriously oppressive.
Can I add something? So I love that answer. Just to add on, I think going back to some of the framing in Jen and Kaya's intro to the volume, questions about mental illness and madness re-raise issues concerning whose mind, right? And we can see this also when we think about various mental states in particular that we talk about. And so when we talk about emotions and pain and other kinds of mental states, and we're thinking of which are the paradigms that we're looking at, it's important to make sure that we're not being exclusionary in picking out certain kinds of minds to look at. I think also work connected with auditory hallucination, for example, connected with mental illness, is affecting some of the discussions of differences among the senses and how we understand sensory perception. So that's another place where I think it comes in.
If I could say very quickly, that I think another area is, and Lugonis talks about this, is what is considered pathological in a society, and often resistance to oppression is considered pathological. And so we see this in Fanon. Lugonis talks about this. Ashley Taylor has a really nice recent piece in Hypatia about what is resistance and what is seen as pathological mind by others.
And can I just say shortly to that? So of course, in the history of pathological people were included enslaved Black people who wanted to run away. This was thought to be a form of madness. So yes.
Thanks, everyone. We have a comment from Kaya, and she wanted to invite our panelists to offer effective strategies to get published in Feminist Philosophy of Mind, given how recent the official birth of the field has been. Thank you, Kaya, for that question.
I think that's a really hard question, just because I wouldn't know how to offer effective strategies for anyone to get published in philosophy in general. So thinking about how to get published in feminist philosophy of mind is really hard. But I mean, it's even harder, to think about that. But I guess I think that hopefully there will be a sort of snowball effect. So as we see more publications coming out in this area, it will become easier and easier. And so one of the things that the volume does is it gives people an anchor point to connect their work to, and maybe offers some sort of legitimization. Not that there should be legitimization needed, but it does, sometimes that can be helpful in terms of publishing, to have anchor point. There's work out there that I'm connecting with. And so I think the volume contributes to that kind of snowball effect. But yeah, I don't know how to offer those strategies in general, so I don't know how to offer them here.
One brief thought connected to Eileen's question about how to smush the boundaries between disciplines and subdisciplines, I think is related to this question of the, how do you publish? Seek out interesting conversations and interesting people. If I'm asked to describe my research method, the true answer is hang out and schmooze. This does not work on grant applications, but as a practical matter of what to do, it works really well. So seek out the people, wherever they might be, in whatever field, who excite you and whose work seems to contribute to your own thinking, and then find ways to hang out there and ways to publish where they're publishing. I'm not saying that's easy, but I think that that's the best way to go about it.
Can I say something there, Jen? Well, actually, Kea, I don't have, of course, a definitive answer to that. But one of the things that you were thinking about in your work, and I wanted to ask you about, I think that, again, if one wants to talk about anchor, people can talk about where their anchors are actually in the same ground. So, for example, in your work, you're talking about externalism, and you are talking about the fact that Putnam and Burge's externalism does not go far enough. And so I wanted to ask you, and so here would be a question. You can think of these questions that are anchored in different traditions, but that really both traditions, or all the traditions that you're thinking about, maybe need to answer that question. So here would be a question for you or for anyone thinking about that. Do you think that part of the problem with the political aspects of power relations in Putnam and Burge's externalism is that division of labor has been understood in terms of cooperation and not considered in terms of coercion, and ongoing coercion constitutive of white settler colonial contexts? For instance, in context of coercion, who the experts are with respect to what a term denotes may be in question, or there may be disputes, not cooperation, amongst experts about the meaning of terms. For example, what in the world they denote. Supposing that this is so, can externalism maintain a purely external boundary? That would be another question. What if what sex the term denotes depends not just on the world, as some realists would have it, but which set of experts are taken up and normalized, which experts' views are taken up and normalized? Won't the external content, either way, whichever way we go, won't that external knowledge have been socialized? So, yeah, taking questions that really come together across these disciplines.
There is a question on embodiment that Jen just mentioned, which I can't seem to find. So Jen, if you can find the question.
So in the chat, not in the Q&A, I'm seeing a question from Sunita Sarkar about it's highly ironic that only the physically embodied philosopher of color explicitly invoked race as a category of experience intersecting with gender. How would the colleagues who are white presenting describe their positions as feminist philosophers? And there's more there, but I want to make sure we got to that before the end of the session. I can speak a little bit to how Kaya and I worked together structuring the book in that regard. And I believe I try to practice a coalitional feminism where we come together across different racialized locations, across different sexualities, identities, class positions, and communication is complex and it doesn't always work and we don't always understand what each other is saying, but we show up and we're there for each other and we work together. And so when Kaya and I designed the structure of the book, we wanted to make sure that we had several voices represented, not just represented, but engaging each other in conversation. Kay and I both work in non-Western philosophy and classical Indian philosophy. And so I think that's a really important and overlooked aspect of the volume is that we have a lot of non-Western philosophy in the volume we're integrating that in philosophy of mind as well. The first section of the volume is called Gender and Race because we didn't want to prioritize gender as a category of analysis in feminist thought, but we also didn't want to presume that everyone was talking about gender, everyone was talking about race, and everyone was in the volume is doing it in the same way, because that's not, a lot of the articles don't center race in the analysis. And so we came up with this neologism, and we have a long footnote about it in the introduction, gender ampersand race ampersand, to signal that it's still an open question how to think about gender and race together, and that and at the end, which categories to privilege in analyses, how to think about them intersectionally or not. And another thing is Kaya and I were strict editors in the sense that we really asked people to substantiate claims about identities and groups with articles that are written by people in those groups, right? So can't just talk about other people, but really need to have a kind of real engagement with their work. And that's what we hope the volume does. And I hope that people can engage outside of their comfort zones in philosophy and also socially to form these kinds of coalitions.